February 9th, 1982, Japan Airlines Flight 350 was scheduled to fly from Fukuoka in Fukuoka Prefecture to Tokyo. It was a domestic flight. On board there were 166 passengers, and amongst them there was also another man who was about to hit a breaking point. A mental breakdown that would make him commit a crime that would take the life of multiple people, that would also leave the public questioning whether it was his mental state that made him commit the crime, or perhaps something else. Welcome to Nihilo, where today I want to talk about an overlooked case of the Japanese Flight 350, which was set to fly on the 9th of February in 1982. However, the flight would never make it to the destination of Tokyo. The plane that would be flown would be a McDonnell Douglas DC-861, registered as JA-8061, and would be flown by its captain Seiji Katagiri, age 35. Alongside him would be a 33-year-old first officer, Yoshifumi Ishikawa, and 48-year-old flight engineer Yoshimi Ozaki. The flight would also have on it a crew with 8, and the total amount of people being 174. The start of the plane ride was totally fine, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The flight went off without a hitch, and everything seemed okay. However, something was brewing in the head of the young pilot Seiji. Something that not many knew of. He was about to crash this plane with all 170 plus people on board. Before we speak about what happened on the flight, we should talk about the pilot Seiji Katagiri. See, before this flight, which would leave 24 people dead, not much was known about Mr. Katagiri, and even after the incident and the court case, little is still known about him. However, what is known is that he was a married man and had flown for quite some time by this point. From the outside to most people, him and his wife looked like a normal Japanese couple, and no one was suspecting what was happening to Katagiri outside of public view. However, what was actually happening to Katagiri was a case of a man struggling with a deteriorating mental state, and had for several years before the crash run into several incidents that showcased his depression and his rapidly deteriorating mind. A few years before the crash, he was granted leave from his work due to his very much fragile mental state. However, he managed to pass the exam given by the Japanese airline and was able to get back to flying. However, what Japan Airlines missed was to check what Katagiri's wife and his doctor knew about him, and that was the crucial details that would leave 24 people dead. And these crucial details is also the stated reason as to why Katagiri was not charged with homicide in this case. However, what the airline also didn't know was that Katagiri was suffering from depression and had once called police to his home because he suspected that someone was tapping his phone. However, when police arrived, they found nothing strange or anything wrong with his phone that would arise suspicion of it being tapped. These strange behaviors and outbursts would get so bad that at one point, Katagiri's wife would actually leave him, only to later return back to him. It was later also determined that Katagiri would be diagnosed to have had paranoid schizophrenia prior to the incident taking place, which would also let him get away with the insanity plea. However, a specific action that was taken by Katagiri after the crash would make many question if the insanity plea was justified or not, which takes us to the flight and crash itself. The flight had taken off without many hitches to start with, and I'd gotten all the way to Tokyo Bay when all of a sudden something would happen. Katagiri stated in legal documents that, "When I switched from autopilot to manual operation in order to land the aircraft, I suddenly felt extremely queasy. I was then overcome by an inexplicable panic and then almost fainted." It was at this point that Katagiri suddenly pushed their control stick forward and engaged the thrust reversers on 2 engines, causing them to lose altitude very fast and heading straight down towards the water to end his life alongside those of 173 other people on board. However, thanks to the quick reaction of co-pilot Yoshifumi, who tried to regain control, the flight was slightly tilted up, and flight engineer Yoshimi Ozaki, who stood up to seize the captain in his action. However, the nose was tilted down too much and broke as the plane crashed and plunged into the water at Tokyo Bay, just 300 yards short of the main runway at Haneda Airport. The crash would leave a total of 24 people dead and would leave another 77 injured and in shock. However, what happened next is what would leave the public angry and frustrated. As the plane had crashed, the first thing that Katagiri did was to swap his pilot's jacket with a civilian cardigan jacket to look like one of the civilians, and was one of the first to be rescued by doing this. This was by the Japanese public seen as a dishonorable and disgusting thing to do that was truly shameful. Not only had he just caused the death of 24 other people, but he was also trying to escape the responsibility of his actions as well. The case caused an uproar, and Katagiri was looked down upon so much that in Japan, still till this day, children call each other Katagiri for having a big ego and acting selfish, sort of like an insult. So by now, the death of 24 people had taken place, and Katagiri, the pilot who caused it, had survived. But next was the case against him, which would leave many stunned and angry, especially the families of the victims. This takes us to the case itself. In court, the defense argued that Katagiri was insane and that he had a clear history of mental disorders that shouldn't have qualified him to be allowed to fly the aircraft to begin with. It was also, through a voice recorder, revealed that before the crash had happened, Katagiri had been shouting nonsense as he was waiting for the crash to happen. His co-pilot was also present in court and testified that Katagiri had been in a state of delusion. However, Katagiri would keep shouting nonsense and seemingly being out of his mind and pushing down the thrusters. This would actually help the defense in pushing for Katagiri to be considered mentally ill and not guilty of his actions. However, many would not agree with this, and that comes from the choices made by Katagiri right after the crash, which was him putting on a civilian jacket to try to get away from his responsibilities. The fact that Katagiri was able to hide with civilians and injured people alongside loads of people in distress and wasn't noticed until much later, as the investigators at the scene first thought the captain had died during the crash, but then he was later found in a hotel where civilians were also being treated, as well as him for minor injuries. This many point to being the point that proves Katagiri knew what he had done and he was aware of it while doing it, and that he was simply trying to escape prosecution. However, it would be the airline's lack of knowledge of the mental incidents before the crash that Katagiri was having that would lead to Katagiri being ruled not guilty by reason of insanity. And it would be determined by investigators for the Japanese government that the incident would be attributed to a lack of proper medical examination on behalf of the Japan Airlines group, which allowed Katagiri to fly at all because Katagiri had already once been put on leave for mental illness. They shouldn't have ever actually let him back on, but they did after he came back to work 3 weeks after hospital examination and took a co-pilot's test in late December 1980, and he passed it and was able to resume work at the end of that month, putting majority of all blame on the airline instead of Katagiri himself. The public would, however, not feel the same, and the families of the victims wouldn't feel the same either. The shameful actions of Katagiri after the crash is what made many think he didn't deserve to get the insanity charge. But he still got it and was committed to a psychiatric ward in Tokyo for several years, where he would stay until his eventual release, where he was not fully cured but considered harmless and not likely to cause any further harm to society and people around him. And what makes many even angrier is that he now lives in relative comfort, with a generous pension to keep him alive and kicking. Many question if Katagiri is haunted by what he did. Many argue he isn't due to his actions right after the crash. Some argue it was simply his natural fight or flight reaction making him act the way he did after the flight crashed. I will leave that question up to you guys. Do you think he was aware of his actions, or do you simply think he was out of his mind? And if so, should he be jailed for what he did? Or should he get away with it? After the crash, Japan Airlines set up a whole new committee that was specifically dedicated to the reviewing of mental and physical health of flight crew to ensure safe flight operations, and also established a support system in place to help struggling pilots that may require psychiatric expertise. Today, however, Katagiri lives close to Mount Fuji, and every day before sunset walks home. However, he walks with a shadow lurking behind him. The souls of 24 people follow in his shadow as he walks. Katagiri is said to stay away from the public and lives with his wife, and when reporters try to approach them and ring on their doorbell, Katagiri's wife responds harshly and angrily to them if they ask anything about that day. Katagiri may or may not be haunted by his crimes, but he's still able to see the sunset in the land of the rising sun. Meanwhile, his victims saw their last sunrise on that unfateful day in 1982. Do you think that Katagiri should be considered guilty, or was he so out of his mind that he can't be considered guilty of what happened? What do you think? This was the case of the suicidal pilot who survived his own crash, the pilot of death. My name has been Nihilo, and if you guys enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe for more similar content, as I'll be covering mysteries, murders, and unsolved crimes on this channel. Thanks again, and I'll see you all the next time.